Hey everyone! I finally finished the Neutrona wand, particle throw, proton wand, positron, collider, proton gun, proton blaster, ghost getting gun, tutorial, and pattern. That makes me very happy. Thank you everyone for your patience. It's been a long time. I'm going to make this tutorial video in 2 parts just so I can get it out sooner rather than later. So part 1 this week, part 2, stay tuned for it next week. Let's make a Neutrona wand. Alright, the first thing you want to do is print your pattern, making sure that it's printing at actual size or 100% scale. They're the same thing. Whew. There's only 2 pages that need to get taped together, so line up those alignment marks and tape it down. Use your scissors and knives to cut out all the parts, leaving the line visible. You'll notice piece 68 has an oval and a circle that you don't want to cut out until after the box is assembled. It's super easy to forget that and cut them out when you're not supposed to, so I like to write myself a little friendly note. Then you can trace everything on your foam. This pattern uses 2mm, 6mm, and 10mm foam. Don't forget not to forget what you're not supposed to forget. And marking any crease lines, V-cut lines, or any other random dotted lines you might find. Mark the centers of any small circly things, and if any pieces say to flip them for the second part, flip them for the second part. Now cut out the pieces, making sure your knife blade is nice and vertical, and cut right on top of that line you drew. I like to use a nice sharp utility knife for the long straight cuts, and a number 11 scalpel for smaller radius curves and the little parts. If you already know the sizes of your switches and lights, you can punch out the holes for them now too. It's a lot easier to do it now than when it's all put together. I'm going to use hot glue for most of the assembly, so it's important to roughen up the heat-sealed surface that's on the back of my cheap hardware store foam. That'll give the glue a much better surface to grab onto. Obviously, you only have to do it where you're actually going to be gluing. So grab pieces 65 and 66, sand them up, and mark a reference line that continues the straight line right through the little tab. The straight edge of piece 67 will get glued right along that line on piece 65. Line up the bottom edges of piece 65 and 67, and work your way to the top. And yes, let's try and keep it nice and square. Now glue piece 66 to the top edge of piece 65, lining it up nicely, and then glue the bottom edge of piece 66 to the bottom edge of piece 67. That way both ends are lined up and we can compress or stretch everything in between to make it fit. When using hot glue, glue about 5 centimeters at a time, hold it till it's totally cool, and then you can glue another 5 centimeters. I recommend using a hot glue gun with a temperature control. That way you can turn the heat down and you don't have to hold your parts together as long. You also won't get as many burnt fingers if you do something like this, which I definitely don't recommend doing. Instead, you can clean up your seams by rubbing them with a scrap piece of foam. Now that's safer. Grab piece 68, transfer the lines to the backside for the V-cut, and then cut a couple of millimeters over from the line and angle it in towards the center. Just try not to cut right through the piece of foam. That wouldn't be super great. Check that it fits on the front of the gun box, then you can put glue in the V-groove and hold it at that angle until it cools. Now the top seam on this is a little bit weird. You're going to be lining up the back of the top edge of piece 68 with the top edge of piece 66. So you want to use a fair bit of glue to fill in that gap behind there. Then you can glue the rest of the edges, leaving the curved section for the last. Gluing the curve is the same idea as the top was, where it's the backside edge that you want to line up with piece 66. Now you can take your super sharp knife and basically keep it lined up with the flat plane of piece 66. Cut along that plane going right around the curve. As you go around the curve, you should be cutting less and less until you're cutting nothing. You can give it a little sanding to smooth it out. It doesn't really matter if that top surface ends up getting fuzzy because it's going to get covered up in a minute anyways. Mark and cut the V-groove on the back of piece 69. It needs to be bent and glued at a right angle. Piece 69 can now be glued onto the rest of the gun box. Grab piece 82, the gun box cover, and score along the score line on the back side. It's really easy to score 2mm foam, just go over and over it with a ballpoint pen while pressing down pretty hard. Now we have a nice cover to hide all the ugly seams we made on the gun box. Glue the cover to the gun box, working section by section until it's all glued down. One quick hint is this is a really good time to turn the temperature of your glue gun right up. That gives you more time to apply the glue and smooth out the cover. Otherwise you can end up with a kind of ripply effect underneath the foam from the glue cooling too soon. You can use your glue gun to melt out any extra glue globs in the vents at the top. Now there is still a little bit of an edge sticking out on the top of that cover, which you can trim off if you like, or not. I kind of like how it looks, but I guess I'm trying to be as accurate as possible, so I guess it's gotta go. Trim off any other bits of the cover that are sticking out, and make sure the cover is glued right to the edges. Now it's time to make the hole for our handle, which will be made from 1-inch PVC conduit. We finally get to cut our don't cut yet hole. The important thing about this cut is to make sure that your knife blade is staying parallel to the table, instead of perpendicular to the foam, which is how you'd normally do it. It's awkward, but it is important because otherwise your handle isn't going to slide in nice and straight. And then you can cut your other don't cut yet hole. Grab your 1-inch PVC conduit and cut a 365mm long piece and a 266mm long piece. I bought myself a nice big conduit cutter after I made the Proton pack, so now I don't have to use my jeweler's saw to cut this stuff anymore. Rub them down with a green scrubby pad so the paint will stick better. Now you can just check and make sure that the longer pipe fits through the bottom 3 holes and the shorter pipe fits in the top hole. Grab the bar graph from the pattern and cover it with some nice clear packing tape. Then you can cut it out and use a tiny bit of glue to glue it over the slot in the gun box. Paint the inside edges of piece 77 black, and when it's dry, superglue it over top of the bar graph for a nice little frame. The main reason for that is just so you can put a light inside if you want and have it a little bit glowy. Alright, crank up your heat gun to a nice hot temperature because now we're going to glue the handle in place. A little bit of pre-glue sanding and a lot of hot glue drizzling. Push the pipe in, making sure it contacts the glue and squishes some up against the end as well. Let that cool and then drizzle some more on top. It's pretty important that this gets solidly glued because there's going to be a fair bit of pressure on the handle. On the barrel pipe, which is the longer one, make a mark 52mm from the end. That's how much of the barrel tube is going to end up sticking out on the handle side of the gun box. But don't glue it in yet, we'll do that later. Now it's time to make a fake welding seam, so unplug your glue gun and wait. We want the glue coming out of the glue gun cool enough so it'll hold its shape once we put it on. If you do it too soon, it'll look good coming out of the gun, but a couple seconds later it'll have smoothed itself out and you won't have those nice welding ripple type things. Once that's cooled, paint around the holes where the toggle switches come out so you won't get paint on them later. Toggle switch, I'll put a link in the description if you want to find where I bought mine. Once the paint is dry, you can install the toggle switches. Obviously you can't tighten the nuts super tight because the foam will just compress. Grab the instrument bar sides and top and bottom, pieces 70 and 71, give them a little sand and make them into a box. Cut out a small section of the bottom piece following the edges of the semicircle. Score on the score lines of the instrument bar cover, piece 72, and glue it on the top of the instrument bar with the 2 flappy bits covering up the ends. Trim off any extra instrument bar cover and glue it into place on the gun box. It should be flush with the gun box on the left side and stick out a bit on the right side. Cut the middle V-groove in the trigger box center, piece 74, and make sure it matches the point of the trigger box side. Then you can cut the other 2 V-grooves as well. Now the switches I'm using don't have a long enough threaded section to go all the way through the 6mm foam plus the 2mm foam that's going to go on top of that. So I basically need to recess the switches into the foam from the back. For the push switch, I punched a hole in the foam the same size as the body of the switch. And for the toggle switch, I had to cut out a rectangle that was the same size as the toggle switch body. Then I glued them both in place from the back. Glue the 3 V-cuts to the correct angle, and then glue the sides on the trigger box. Score the score lines on the back of the trigger box cover, piece 75, punch holes the right sizes for your switches, wrap the trigger box cover around the trigger box, and glue it down. Glue piece 76 on the bottom of the trigger box and trim the edges. Figure out the placement of the trigger box on the side of the gun box and trace around it. You can see the point lines up with the edge of the gun box and it sits at the same angle. And glue it down. Glue a piece 80 into the end of the barrel, the end that you put a mark on earlier, and glue piece 81 on top of that. Glue the rear cylinder ring, piece 79, around the outside edge. Cut off any overlap, and you're good to go. Grab a 5mm wide strip of 2mm thick foam and cut 9 strips the same width as the heatsink pattern. Apply super glue onto the strips and then glue them down onto the lines. Just don't glue them down to the first and last lines. When all the strips are glued down, cut out the heatsink, cutting right along the edge of the strips. And on the inside edge of the lines on each end. Turn the heatsink upside down on the table and glue a wider strip on each end. Then trim off any extra from those strips that sticks out from the ends or back. Glue it in place on the side. The one edge gets aligned with the vertical edge coming down from the top of the gun box. On the other side, mark a line approximately 9mm up from the bottom edge. Trace around where you think your 2 piece 86s should go. Glue a little piece 87 on the edge of each piece 86, and glue them in place on the circle marks you made. On a piece of 1/2-inch PVC conduit, draw a half a rainbow. Try to make the rainbow match the curve of the gun box. Cut out the rainbow, file the rainbow, and sand the rainbow until you've got something that looks beautiful, like a rainbow. Cut the pipe 13 millimeters from the short side and mark the center of its position on the gun box. Drill a small hole that goes vertically down through that mark and screw in a screw that goes a little deeper than the piece of pipe. Why the screw? For extra strength. Now you can super glue the pipe in place and cover up that screw with a bunch of hot glue. Use the old unplug the glue gun and patiently let it cool down until it creates a relatively nice welding bead technique. Cut a 6 millimeter wide piece of 1-inch PVC, go outside, put on a respirator, find a solid round something or other that's close to the size of the inside of the pipe, and grab a coarse file. Heat up the PVC until it gets soft. A good way to know when it's getting soft is the marks from the cutter will magically disappear. While it's still soft, give the PVC ring a roll on your coarse file while pressing down pretty hard. This will imprint the texture onto the PVC and make it look like a knurled knob. If it doesn't turn out as good as you'd like, you can always reheat the PVC, the pattern will disappear, and you can start again. I found for myself when I rocked it side to side a bit as I went, I got a much more consistent pattern. Sand the edges smooth. Use the ring to make an impression on some foam, cut along the inside line, super glue the disc in the ring, and super glue the knob in place. Now slide the barrel into place, lining up the 52 millimeter mark with the edge of the gun box. Glue the pipe to the instrument bar by squeezing some super glue in there, and then reinforce it on the inside with tons of hot glue. Now grab a piece of 10 millimeter foam with your favorite creator's logo etched into it. Trace 6 hand grips on it, 4 with the pattern right side up and 2 with the pattern flipped over. Make sure to mark the flipped ones somehow so you remember which ones they are. Cut out the hand grips. It's hard to get a nice clean cut on the wiggly section of the hand grips, but that's okay because we're going to be sanding them down later. But before we do that, we've got to glue them into 2 hand grip stacks. So grab your contact cement and glue 2 stacks of 2 hand grips together to start with. I'm using water-based contact cement here because there's less fumes. Once the contact cement has dried, you can line up the 2 pieces and squish them together really hard. Now repeat the same process for the 3rd layer of the handle stack. I made myself a little foam paintbrush to help spread the glue better. And once dry, stack up the 3rd layer. The main thing we want is to end up with the smooth sides of the foam to the outside. Obviously right now that hand grip is not very ergonometric, so start rounding off the wiggly side with your knife. It doesn't have to look pretty, mine certainly doesn't. Now you can sand the contours into it. I used a rotary tool with a random nail stuck into it and a coarse piece of sandpaper taped to the nail, wrapped around the nail, and then taped again at the base to keep it from flapping around. This gives you a great, super cheap tool that you can use to carve the contours into the hand grip. In order to stay in control of my swiftly spinning tool, you can see that I'm always using my thumb as a bit of a brace or anchor point. I'm also only pressing down on the tool when I'm moving it against the direction that it's spinning. Again, this helps keep the tool from running away from you and sanding your fingers off, which would be bad. And of course, don't forget your lung protection. Now grab a sheet of 2 millimeter thick foam and heat it with your heat gun. For this process, the softer the foam the better, which is why I'm not using the red foam I normally use. Take your nice warm foam and mold it over the hand grip. The main spots you want to concentrate your super molding strength are the valleys between the bumps. Just keep pulling down on the sides of the foam in those areas. If you're not happy with it, you may need to heat it another time and do it again. If you are happy with it, set it back on the hand grip, fold back a small section, and start gluing it down, section by section. You want to do that same pulling and squeezing down on the sides while the glue cools. You may also find that by raising it up a little bit, it's easier to pull down on the sides because you're not hitting the table. It would probably also be easier if the thing it was sitting on wasn't round, but that's what I had at the time, so, you know. Once you've got that top wavy section all glued down nice and pretty, you can come back and glue the sheet down to the sides of the handle. Now the other awkward thing we have to do is make the back of the hand grip concave. It needs to have the same curvature as the pipe we're using for the handle and the barrel. So basically I just hacked away at it with my knife until I had something like this. Then I wrapped some coarse sandpaper around some 1-inch pipe and sanded it like crazy. Make a mark 2 centimeters from the tip of the barrel and use super glue to glue the hand grip to the side of the barrel starting at that mark. Glue the other hand grip to the bottom side of the handle. Give a slight gap between the handle and the instrument bar. If the edges of the handle aren't totally glued down, you can go along with the hot glue gun and fix that up. Cut piece 92 from 10 millimeter foam and glue it beside the handle on the barrel. Grab the barrel ring, piece 93, and wrap it around the barrel where it meets the gun box. Unplug your glue gun, and eventually start welding. Cut 2 more 1-inch PVC pipes, one 55mm and one 39mm. Give them a little scrub. Grab the shorter pipe, glue a piece 80 inside and a piece 81 on top of that. Then you can glue that random pipe to the gun box beside the barrel. Glue a piece 80 in and a piece 81 on top of the 55mm pipe, and glue that into piece 83, the Clippard mount. That's right, it's time to make the Clippard valve. Okay, so I actually changed the way I made this valve halfway through, so don't pay any attention to the fact I'm painting it black. But you can pay attention to the two 12mm discs I just cut out, and the glue stick lid my daughter gave me. Glue the 2 discs in a stack inside the lid. You want the last disc to stick out just slightly past the end of the glue cap. A little more glue just for good measure, a little silver paint for silveriness, silver paint on the top of the Clippard valve except for in the middle where you're going to be gluing, some glue where you're going to be gluing, and there you go, a knob, so you can adjust your Clippard valve. I like to set mine on high. Alright, so remember when I told you to forget the black? Well, this is me undoing the black. A better option would be to make a mark 14mm down from the top of the Clippard valve. Use your tubing cutter on that line, but don't cut all the way through. Just make a really nice groove. Grab some aluminum tape that's used for ductwork, cut off a strip about 2 cm wide, and apply it to the Clippard valve, lining up the straight edge with the top of the valve. Cut off the excess and rub it smooth with the side of a pen. Cut along the groove you made with your tubing cutter, and peel the excess aluminum tape away. Use your green scrubby to give the aluminum a nice satin finish, touch up the silver paint on the top, and paint the rest of the Clippard valve black. Again. Once dry, the Clippard valve gets glued onto the gun body, lining up the pointier edge of the valve mount with the side of the gun body. Okay, now time for the knobs and lights. To be honest, I had a hard time finding existing things that were close enough to what I needed, so I decided to make my own. I carefully got out some candles. Cut off a chunk of one of the candles, hammered the head of a nail till it was flat, heated it up, and melted it halfway into the candle. I tried to keep the nail in line with the candle as much as possible until it cooled. Stuck the nail in my rotary tool, and boom, a mini lathe. I'm running my rotary tool at a fairly slow speed. I don't want to melt the wax, and I don't want anything to go flying crazily around the room. And the cutter I'm using is just a sharpened concrete nail. The knob I'm making here is going to be the front knob. It's quite a tall knob, so it's hard to make out of foam, and it has an angled lip at the bottom. Once I was happy with the knob, I heated up the nail again until I could pull it out. I just had to be careful not to melt the knob while I was heating the nail. I also made a little light and the shaft collar. Of course, wax isn't super strong, so I'm gonna need to make a mold. Out of cornstarch, of course, which I will put in a bowl in the bathroom while I have a long steamy shower. I'm doing this because I need the cornstarch to absorb some of the moisture that's in the bathroom. I'm going to mix it with some 100% silicone caulking, and the moisture in the cornstarch is what's going to make the caulking cure. You want to keep adding cornstarch until the mixture becomes basically like a putty. The biggest mistake you can make is grabbing it with your hands too soon, because then you'll end up with something like this. That was my first try. It did not end well. Anyways, eventually, as you keep adding cornstarch, you should end up with something a little more like this. It's nice and soft, but it's not sticking to my hands like crazy. I should mention that before you make your putty, you should also maybe make some sort of frame for your mold. I cut up an old paint bottle to make a simple tube. Fill the tube up with the putty you just made, and push the knob down into the putty. Flip the mold over so the knob is against some non-stick surface on your table, and press the putty down a bit more from the top. Now go to bed, have a good sleep, and you should have a brand new mold in the morning. Alright, that's part 1. Make sure to come back next week, and we'll see if those molds turned out, or if they were a horrible failure. I do have the pattern out already, and there will be a link up here or in the description below. I also have links in the description to some of the parts that I use that might be harder to find, and they are Amazon links, so they do help support my channel if you buy things through them. There's still lots of great stuff to come, making a super sweet V-hook, and making this tube slide in and out. And many more things. Thanks for watching. See ya. Why are there so many names for this thing? It just does one thing. Zaps. get that. I don't even know what it does.